Hi everyone, I'm thriller author J.F.Penn, and today on Killer Thrillers TV, I'm interviewing best-selling and award-winning thriller author Grant McKenzie. So welcome, Grant.
Thanks for having me.
Oh no, it's great to have you on the show. So maybe we can start by you telling us a bit about you and your writing background.
Sure. I was originally born in Glasgow, Scotland, and as a teenager, my family immigrated to Canada, and I ended up in cowboy town Calgary, Alberta, which was nothing like the John Wayne movies that I expected it to be like, but very different from Glasgow. After I'd been there for an awfully long time, I moved to Victoria, which is the west end, far west of Canada, on the ocean. Very much like basically it's Britain in Canada. Very, 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 very English. So it's high tea and all that
Oh,
stuff. Although the Scottish Butcher just closed down, that was a shame. And my career has been as a journalist. I've been a journalist for 30 years, working for major dailies all across Canada. But I've always written. As most writers do, you start from, I think I did my first trilogy of plays back in East Kilbride in Scotland when I was, 8 or 9 years old, kind of thing. I've been writing ever since. So and then my first sort of published novel, which of course is never your first written one, it was my fifth one I wrote. My first published novel, Switch, which is set in Seattle mostly, but it was actually first published in the UK by Random House. So even though I've been away from the UK for so long, my writing still seemed to have a stronger appeal in the UK. I'm not sure exactly what that's about. But now I'm being published around the world, the US, Canada, Germany, and stuff. So they're finally catching up to me.
no, fantastic. And yeah, your accent has got kind of all these different tones in, hasn't it? Sort of,
It has. It's last time I was in Glasgow, which was quite a while ago now. I think 10 years ago. One of the first people I met said, "Well, where the heck are you from?" Because I don't speak Glaswegian anymore because I grew up, in a working class family, so my accent was very broad, Glaswegian, which of course nobody in Canada understood. So it's changed dramatically. And that's the thing. Sometimes the accent comes on strong, and other times people don't hear it at all. So it's not consistent at all.
no, it's fascinating. My family's got some Scottish in. So, tell us a bit about Karma, your most recent book.
K.A.R.M.A's been really interesting, especially when you look at the reviews on Amazon. K.A.R.M.A is an acronym that stands for Kids Against Rape, Murder, Abuse. So it's a very dark tale, revenge tale about this group of mostly teenagers, some of them younger, who are based around the US and Canada, who form a group together on the internet to exact revenge against the people who have harmed them, who have done sexual abuse against them, and various other forms of abuse. So it's a very dark premise. I thought it was a very important premise, especially being a journalist. A lot of the stories are taken from real life stories that sort of upset me as a journalist, and changed. But then what I did is I really wrapped it in a real fast paced, edge of your seat thriller plotline because that's what I like to read, and also I think it's much easier to get a strong message across when you can package it in something that's also entertaining. So the reviews have been fascinating because there's a lot of, most of them are 5-star, which is great. But it's funny, I had done a giveaway not that long ago, and so people pick it up and think, "Oh, I'll grab this book." And these are people who normally read young adult romance
Yes.
or something similar, and then they read the first chapter of K.A.R.M.A and they're like, "Ah!" They're just like horrified because it's very dark. And I find some of those reviews quite fascinating because it's like, well, really, you probably shouldn't have picked up the book in the first place. But it's also been interesting to see people who normally wouldn't pick up this type of book who get hooked on it because
Yeah.
I try to write in a very thriller way, and they get hooked, and then before they know it, they finish the book, and they're kind of like, I shouldn't have liked that book, but I really like that book. So it's been really kind of interesting to see that reaction.
Yeah, and so is it a YA? Because of course, we've got the Hunger Games, which is a YA crossover as fact, as such, and a lot of young people and violence, is reality. Is your book a YA crossover? I suppose.
Um, it was never intended that way,
Mm,
especially because YA I think changed
mm,
so much. Because I've written a young adult novel called Avalanche on the Prairie, which is a really fun book. It's not really in a lot of mainstream bookstores. It's one of those books that one of the main characters has Down syndrome, with
mm,
Down syndrome. So it's in every Down syndrome library across North America, and I get fabulous response from parents of Down syndrome children. But it's also based on, I grew up reading Enid Blyton's
mm.
Famous Five,
Yeah.
and it's kind of like my interpretation of Famous Five, of how I would have liked Famous Five to be. Because if you read them now, you go, oh, what the hell was I thinking
Yeah,
back then?
yeah.
But now it's kind of like, where you take it and you filter it through your imagination. You thought, really, Famous Five should have been like this. And so, but that was a very soft, very easy, what I would have classified YA. But now YA's changed so much that there really is blurred, But I mean, it really was intended for adults. But I've always believed, when I was a young, when I was 13 and stuff like that, I mean, I went out and scoured and bought the entire Mickey Spillane library, which I don't think were ever meant to be YA, and Raymond Chandler and Dashiell Hammett, and I read all those books, so I have absolutely no problem with younger readers, reading this stuff, because I think it's all A, good story, but B, also important subject matter.
No, absolutely. And you mentioned revenge there in K.A.R.M.A, and also some of the aspects that come up in your journalism. So are there some themes that come out over and over again in your work that you really care about?
There definitely tends to be. I don't think it was necessarily on purpose, but I definitely noticed that it comes out. I even, in Victoria here, I was editor-in-chief of Monday Magazine, which is an alt weekly magazine, so that really deals with alternative issues and stuff like that. And as soon as I became editor, and I didn't really plan this, but it just really happened, I became very, very passionate. There had been several attacks on women in the city, and I became very passionate about protesting against violence against women. And it ended up becoming like this sort of year-long theme, whereas a lot of the feature stories I assigned and a lot of the people we interviewed, and we even started a rally for violence against women that raised a ton of money for local groups. So I really do find that I have sort of really strong issues about violence against innocents, whether that's women, whether that's children, whether that's men. And I think a lot of it also comes from, as a young, sensitive lad growing up in Glasgow, you're a little bit, because at the time I was growing up in Glasgow, it was the murder capital of Europe. It's the cultural capital of Europe, which is nicer, but it's kind of a tougher place back then, and it weren't really, somebody who wrote poetry and short stories and plays was not really the norm of what was happening around you. So I think I really grew up with a real dichotomy, in the sense of being surrounded by a lot of violence, a lot of bullies, and so as I've become older and more empowered, especially in my writing, I kind of take a strong issue against these types of sins.
Yeah, and I think that's important. But equally, as writing fast-paced kind of thrillers, violence is an important part of the plotting in a way, isn't it? So we kind of drawn to that.
Yeah, absolutely. It's it really is what can propel a story from one to the other. With K.A.R.M.A, there's a lot of sort of implied violence, in the sense that I'm one of these writers that really loves to take the reader to that dark door, and I don't necessarily open the dark door, but I lead you to the door and let the reader's imagination take them through. It was interesting, my book Switch came out in Canada, published by Penguin Canada. The Winnipeg Free Press ran a review, and it was interesting in this review. He didn't like the book at all. It's a bad review. But what I really liked about the review is that he had gone through all of these dark doors that I had laid out for him, and then he blasted me for what he found behind those doors. And of course, nothing behind those doors I had actually written. It was all his imagination. But then he gave me hell for what he had unlocked in his own imagination, which of course is probably much worse than I could have written. are much darker than I could have written. It's like, wait a minute, who are we criticizing here? But I find that quite interesting. Where sometimes, and I find that even with the reviews of K.A.R.M.A, some people will say, oh, "This was so explicit." It's like, was it? If you actually read it, it's not. I lead you in a direction that says a horrible thing could have happened here. But I don't necessarily describe the horrible thing, but I have led you on a path that allows your imagination to fill it in, which I find is much more horrifying a lot of times than the writer telling it.
And I think, as I write kind of fight scenes and things as well, and I've never experienced them, and I think as writers we're often, helping people deal with things that hopefully they never have to deal with. It's, we're just kind of going there, and, and I wanted to ask you, you write two different kinds of books, don't you? And one of them is a woman. Tell us about that.
Yeah, the MC Grant, I write a series. My pen name is MC Grant. And the reason we went with the pen name is because my original intention was I didn't really want the reader to know it was written by a man, because I wanted them to accept that the protagonist of those books is Dixie Flynn, a young sort of mid-30s reporter for an alt weekly in San Francisco. And she's kind of she's trapped between the old school journalism and the new journalism. And I, of course, I'm an old school kind of journalist, so a lot of my frustrations about how journalism has changed and disintegrated and fallen apart is kind of in there. And she's kind of one of those people that's kind of still holding on to those sort of older ways. But and she's very, very tough. She's a tough woman who gets tougher sort of as each book. The first book was called Angel with a Bullet. And the second book that comes out in September is called Devil with a Gun. And the experiences that Dixie goes through Angel with a Bullet kind of makes her tougher, so that when Devil with a Gun starts, she's actually a tougher individual. But I really like her. She's really sassy. She's really quirky. She has a lot of the qualities that I loved in those books I was mentioning earlier, like Mickey Spillane, Dashiell Hammett, Raymond Chandler, but in a female form. Plus, with all my experience as a journalist, she has a lot of insight into journalism. And she also has Dixie's tips spread out throughout the book. And Dixie's tips can be anything about advice on boyfriends. For instance, she likes to, when she can't get to sleep, she'll count ex-boyfriends leaping over her bed. Kind of things, and she describes how each one and why it was it didn't work and stuff. She's not very lucky in love, unfortunately. So there's and it's got tips about how to deal with your mother. Proper way to load a gun. Why not to throw up in a murder scene. So it's got all these variety of tips that she, just life lessons that she imparts to the reader. And it's written in first person, female, which is different from my regular books, which are third person. And the interesting thing about the MC Grant books is I actually wrote the very first draft of Angel with a Bullet 20-some-odd years ago. I was a 26-year-old working for the Calgary Herald at the time, a daily newspaper here. And I, of course, always wanted to be a writer. And I thought to myself, one of these days, if I don't write this book now, because it's very difficult to start a novel when you're working full-time. So if I don't start this novel now, will I ever get to it? So I took a chance, and I actually took some time off work, and much to the chagrin of my wife, because I wasn't earning any money, and I wrote the first draft of this book. And it went out, and it got, those sort of positive rejections that books get, and didn't go anywhere. And I kept writing, and it was my fifth novel. It was my first published novel. But after I'd published that novel and written a second novel for Bantam, I kind of thought, I still like that first novel. I kind of had liked it. So I rewrote it, and of course I'm a better writer now, which is always helpful. I rewrote it, polished it up, and sent it to my agent, and 3 weeks later it sold to Midnight Ink. So then they asked for a second book. So that was an awfully long journey, which shows you how stubborn writers have to be.
Yeah, but so why did you decide to write in a first-person female point of view?
For me, what I really wanted is I wanted the character to be both tough and vulnerable. And a lot of times when you're writing male characters, introducing vulnerability can come across as weakness, and I didn't want the character to be weak. But I wanted this vulnerability. I wanted the reader to feel that when she's in a particularly perilous situation, such as when she arrives at the snooping around the warehouse and it catches on fire and she's in the middle of this fire, I wanted the reader to kind of think, well, this isn't a Superman. This isn't Jack Reacher, who can fly at times and has with his toothbrush, he'll conquer the world. I wanted this to be a normal human being that, what the heck is she going to do? And I felt that making her female gave me that vulnerability without it being a weakness. Whereas sometimes showing vulnerability in male characters is just a bit more difficult because we have this preconception, especially with male thriller protagonists, where we have this protection that should be all tough guys that can take a punch and get up, whereas most authors take a punch and they're down. They're not getting back up.
Yeah.
Right? And so I kind of felt that and it also gave me a sort of different perspective as well in how she went. But I really wanted that sort of, that vulnerability and the strength combined that I felt a female protagonist gave me.
And presumably you went with MC Grant as a pseudonym, so that people wouldn't guess your gender.
That was my intention, so they wouldn't guess the gender. But then Midnight Ink put my picture on the back of the book, which defeated the whole purpose.
Well, I'm fascinated by this because I was using Joanna pen, and then I got my reviews on Amazon were like, this is far too violent for a woman to be writing. So I actually went and rebranded around J.F.Penn so that people wouldn't question my gender, which is hilarious because now you're doing the kind of the opposite. So do you think this is totally wrong? I mean, is there a gender bias in publishing and who buys books, and does anyone care, do you think, really?
I think the readers do. I don't think the publishers really, especially now, I think it's a real, even playing field because there's been so many female author superstars come out. I think before it definitely was a male-dominated sort of field, and there was a few sort of women superstars. But now I think it's a very fair game as far as publishers are concerned. But I think readers still react to the gender of the author because I still get reviews, even though I've always been surrounded by women. My family, my wife and my daughter, of course, read my stuff and tell me where I'm going wrong. But I've always been surrounded by women, but I still get. You can tell where people sometimes the reviews will say, "Oh, you can tell this was written by a man," right? And I think they don't think that until after they get to the end and they see my picture. So that's because I've had a lot of female readers go through it first, and so you tend to not get a reaction just on the story. A lot of times you get a reaction if people don't like something or if they're looking. Because a lot of times reviewers are looking for something to criticize, and that's kind of an easy one. He's male, thus his female character probably got it. Sort of.
No, it's fascinating. I find that so interesting. But anyway, so tell us a bit about your writing life. Do you have a routine, a special place? How does your writing routine work?
It changes dramatically according to what job I have at the time and stuff like that. When I was working at the Vancouver Sun, I was living in this tiny little fishing village called Gibson's, which is where they filmed The Beachcomber. It's a very famous Canadian soap for a long, long time, which is off the air. But anyway, this beautiful, scenic little fishing village, and I had to take a ferry every day. And the ferry only ran every 2 hours, so you always had to catch a really early ferry, and then you came home on a very late ferry, which made for a really long day. But on that particular, when I had that job, I started writing on the ferry. So I'd write on the ferry commute, going to work and coming back from work. And that was really, really good because it really kind of said, okay, we're on the ferry for an hour, so we got to sit down, get the laptop out, and write. And you train yourself so that, I think when writers first start out, they have this, especially I think it comes from the poetry world, they think, you have to have a muse, and then you come to you and stuff. And then as you become a working writer, you realize you can't hang around for you gotta an hour, you gotta sit down, you gotta write, and as you do that, of course, as soon as you start writing, the inspiration comes, because you've trained your mind to just unlock that part of your creative brain. And I think that's an important part of it. But as I've worked different jobs, that always hasn't been so simple. As editor-in-chief of Monday Magazine, that was a real 24/7 news job, so it was very difficult to switch off my brain. So I really had to make sort of lock the door at home, and what times at night or early morning or wherever and stuff. But so the routine gets broken, and I find that becomes difficult. I find writing becomes easier the more you do have a routine, and you can write at the same time every day. even if it's the same spot. So it doesn't even have to be the same spot, but just that sometimes that locks your brain and say, okay, that chair is my writing chair. When I sit in that chair, you switch off the internet and Twitter and you write. And a lot of times you're just training yourself, to do that. And I think that's very important. So I try my best to make that work, but a lot of it really depends on where I'm working at the time and what the hours are like and stuff like that. Sort of. And deadlines help, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely.
Your help, but when you sign a new book contract, it's like, oh, okay, I gotta do this now. So you can't procrastinate.
Fantastic. So, and who do you read for pleasure? Who are your favourite writers to read?
Well, I have a lot. I tend to read. I mean, of course, I read in my own genre. I read a lot of thriller writers. And I've always been a big fan of John Sanford and Stephen White and those guys, and Stephen Hunter. But I also really like to go sort of off genre, where I really like hard sci-fi. So I find that that's something that I don't write, and so I really get involved in it because a lot of times I'm reading a thriller, I'm also editing the book at the same time I'm reading it, which can take you out of it. But I would have maybe done this, or that was a good idea. So it takes you out. But I read hard science fiction. One of my favorite authors, Robert McCammon, is classified as a horror writer, but I think that's like a lot of writers. I don't think that's quite the right genre that he should be put in. He's been put in this little hole, and a lot of it shouldn't be put in little holes because it stops the creative flow. But he's a terrific writer from down south, and he writes in that sort of historical, and there's horror elements, but I don't really call him a horror writer. And so, and I also read a lot of my fellow writers that are in the same genre all the time. And really, James Rollins is always a good one.
Oh yeah, he's my favourite, I think.
Yeah, he writes those big group sort of fantasy thrillers that I would never try because I don't know how he writes so much because he does a fantastic job.
He does.
So a lot of times I just get lost in his books, and that's real pleasure because it's like, I would never write a book this ambitious. I wouldn't know where to begin. I don't know how.
Luckily, there's a big world of us out there. So
that's right.
Yeah. No, that's fantastic. So where can people find you and your books?
I'm all over Amazon, and I'm in local bookstores in Canada. In the US, it's easier to find me on Amazon. And in the UK, I was doing really good until Borders went under. And then, because they were a huge supporter of me, the Border store in Glasgow had a big window display and were very supportive, and then they went under. And I take no responsibility for that, but that was that was very sad. That was very sad. So,
and you have a website as well?
I do. It's grantmckenzie.net.
Fantastic. Well, thanks ever so much for your time, Grant. That was really fun.
Yeah, well, thanks for having me. I really enjoyed it.